Welcome, everyone. Marianne Feldheim. I'm your moderator for this session, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce Mark Brewer, who will be talking about aligning nonprofits aligning with sustainability goals. Now, Mark Brewer is the president and chief executive officer for the Central Florida Foundation. He's been with them since 2000. We know Mark because he has been on our advisory board since almost 2001 at the very beginning. He's been a very dedicated member, and he's very well known around the country and certainly in Central Florida for being an expert on philanthropy on the nonprofit sector. He has a bachelor's in business administration, a master's in public administration, and he has all but done ABD with a doctorate in public administration. But today he's going to talk about one of the initiatives of the Central Florida Foundation, helping nonprofits align with sustainability goals. And this really looks at ways to be socially responsible while providing the services that nonprofits are doing. So I am going to turn it over to Mark, who can share his screen and go forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. You have to allow me to share my screen, though. Right now, you've got me turned off, and
I will do that.
Okay, thanks. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for joining for this discussion, which is becoming a discussion around the country as the Sustainable Development Goals begin to take root in not just the nonprofit sector, but also the public sector. So I think you may know that most jurisdictions around the country have a connection now to SDGs for what they call their sustainability work. I'm still disabled, Marianne. And that
I don't have control, Mark. Kakali does.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yes, just give me 1 second. I'm trying to figure it out.
No problem. This is always the case with technology. It works great until it doesn't, and then you have to start over. So SDGs are now taking root around the country as a way that we can think differently about getting to outcomes in the long range. And so when the city of Orlando and Orange County, they think about sustainable development goals in a way to help guide specific areas they're working on in sustainability. Some of that is environmental, some of it deals with other issues that they're working on. Thank you very much, it works now.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
And so as they start thinking about how that works and what they're going to do with it, they need something longer range than just a plan or some set of goals to look at. And philanthropy, it turns out, is in the same boat. Philanthropy is a space in which many times people think in philanthropy like it's a marathon. So they think in terms of how could I solve a problem that I've got by just incrementally making changes. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a philanthropist and you're giving money to feed hungry children, and that's a good thing. And next year you boost the amount of money you're giving by a few $1,000s so you can feed more hungry people. And so now you think to yourself, okay, I'm doing really well here. I'm really moving the needle. Well, you are, but it's like running a marathon. You don't know who else is in the race with you. The Sustainable Development Goals are an internationally agreed upon set of goals that allow a power of understanding and planning and a set of horizons. And so in the real world of strategy development, you want a horizon, and it should be a stretch, it should be a reach. The SDGs are not only a reach, but they have to be, most of them have to be finalized by 2030. And the chance that we'll get to many of them is slim. However, just under the surface of the SDGs, there is a look at what's most important about Sustainable Development Goal strategy. And that's what philanthropy is beginning to take hold of. The Central Florida Foundation, for really almost 20 years now, has been a holder of data for nonprofits. And if you've not been to the foundation website, you can visit it at cffound.org. And when you go, if you click on nonprofit search, you'll be able to look at a profile for almost every nonprofit in the region. And when you look at those nonprofit profiles, you'll be able to see what sustainable development goals are they working on. So we've tied them together so that you can see where the missions fit in the sustainable development goals. So as the cities and counties around the country and philanthropy begins to move in this direction, we now have to start thinking about how are we moving against these 17 horizons and how do we get there faster? Well, you can't really do it with the goals inside the SDGs because they're big, they're global, and they're agreed on at the UN by nations around the world. So now you have to add something in the center of that measure to help you get there. So the social determinants of health are the next set of measures that tie to the SDGs. You may know this, but every decision made in pretty much every community in America every year is tied to the social determinants of health. They are the things that tell us, are people getting healthier or less healthy? Are they doing better or less well than they were last year? And using those social determinants of health along with the sustainable development goals creates a nice kind of runway for us to put philanthropy on and to move in that direction. Well, it doesn't help if we're all moving in that direction, but there's no capital focused in helping us get there. So the Central Florida Foundation this year has launched an initiative called Thrive. And when you go to the website, you can click on Thrive and you'll actually be able to see the scorecards along with the SDGs that each of the Thrive funds focus on. The Thrive funds are meant to try to figure out how do we move the needle with innovation tied to the SDGs and using a scorecard on the social determinants of health so we can watch things move. Here's an example of what I mean. We do every couple of years in this community and most others around the country, a community health needs assessment. It's where the hospitals get together and they go out and they get answers to a lot of data questions. And it helps them kind of understand where do they need to put their firepower? Where do they need to focus their time and energy in healthcare based on what they learn in the community health needs analysis? Well, the interesting thing is that if you look at the current one tied to the 2016 one, because it's only done every 3 years, you'll notice some things that are kind of troubling. Childhood immunizations, 1.8% down. Obesity, 5% up. Diabetes remained flat except for 12 to 18-year-olds where it increased. Childhood obesity, 12.3% of middle school students are obese. That's an increase over 2016. And cardiovascular disease, up 1.7% on the mortality side. And so when you start to look at scorecards at a larger level to try to figure out, are we actually moving a needle? That brings you to why the SDGs are so important in the things that we think about. The SDGs provide the horizon that lets philanthropy tie its goals and its capital to actually moving needles. And so the only way to know that things are getting better is to measure them. And you got to measure a lot of things, and everybody's got a different study. So the concept is to tie all of these things together under the SDGs. Now, look, if you're not familiar with them or you haven't seen the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them, and they're all big. Some of them are huge, including number 1, no poverty. We're clearly not going to get there by 2030. But the no poverty goal has under it a whole set of stipulations that people have agreed to. And around the world, economies and policy is moving to try to hinder the growth of poverty and to reduce it where we can. So it would only make sense that if jurisdictions and policymakers are focusing on sustainable development goals, that philanthropy should be focused there too. And in fact, I would say if you're just a donor, just a giver, you should be focused there to know, are we all moving in a vertical fashion to try to solve a problem in the appropriate way? So as you look at these 17, you'll notice they're also broad. So when you think about quality education, number 4, that isn't just K through 12 or just college, it's all education combined. Reducing inequities, this is where we get into not just equality, but equity and equality. And the inequalities.
Excuse me, Mark?
Yeah.
Mark, are you sharing your screen? We can't see a.
You can't.
No, we cannot.
Well, then I'm looking at it by myself, and that's never good.
Thank you.
All right, let's see this. Now can you
Now
see
we
it?
see it.
Oh, perfect. All right, so when you get to number 10, that is reduced inequities, this is about solving the systemic problems that cause equity issues around the world. And so you can imagine there are parts of the world where these equity issues are much deeper than they are in the United States. And there are 2 areas of number 10 that are deeper in the US than they are anywhere else in the Western world. So this now begins to provide us some alignment, some thinking process around what are we working on and what are we trying to get to. And as we now start to tie our grant making and philanthropy goals to this, what we're doing is helping nonprofits connect to the SDGs, connect the work they're doing, and connect their measures to the SDGs. So now we're all looking at the same scorecard, which is unusual. It's not unusual, I'm sorry to say, that many people are doing the same thing in a different way, and it's sometimes complicated, or at least complex, to figure out whether or not they're doing it better or worse than each other, because we're not using a standard set of measures to do that. So the purpose here is to try to figure out, how do we make this work? And the Thrive initiative is really set up in this fashion to try to make certain that we can not only guide capital toward these things, but measure the work using the SDGs. So there are 5 impact funds under Thrive: economic stability, livability, education, community and social connection, and healthcare. And these are all system-oriented funds. So if you think about these for a minute and you see what's underneath each of these categories, you'll note that they all tie together in a way that you can see there's a horizon for which, if you want to solve most of the SDGs, you have to work on more than one thing at once. And so the Thrive areas now begin to tie things together that matter. An example would be economic stability. Well, employment is certainly important. No one would argue that. Income and wages is important, but that's also an equity issue. Expenses are important. Housing is important. Transportation is important, but you might not think about hunger and innovation as being important pieces of economic stability. So the key is that all of these things together, created to move against a strategy, would help us get to an end. And that's the case in any of these. So if you look through them, you'll see some streams, or some seams, I should say, that connect together, that make this into a systems approach. And the systems approach allows us to begin thinking about, how are we going to implement things? And you have to start doing that in pilot areas. So you do pilots, you identify the pilots that work, and then you scale them using capital that's been invested against these 5 areas, and using the SDGs to figure it out. So here's an example of the scorecard, which you'll see if you look at the website for economic stability. One of the indicators is the percentage of the population under the poverty line. Well, that's clearly connected with the SDG. Well, the current status for Central Florida is 16.7%. That ranks us 31 out of 67 Florida counties. So the trend is up, but the trend is in red, indicating that's not really where we want to go. So we're not getting better, we're getting worse. And if we don't look at this every year against the things we're doing in the space that is supposed to solve it, then we'll really never know if those things are working. So our goal here is to try to bring capital and a set of measures together in a way that people can put their hands around them and see them, and then to link all of this together. So when you think about Thrive, and you think about each of the impact funds underneath it, and then you think about the things that they're focused on, you begin to get a sense of how all of this fits together at the bottom. And we can measure each thing separately if you're into individual measurement. But the strategy here is to begin to think about these things as a system, as a whole. One of the examples of that, clearly under health, COVID is there, but preventable deaths and access to healthcare, 2 things that are sit right alongside COVID, are also being addressed by that fund. It will be investing shortly in pilots that will try to solve these problems so that they can be implemented and scaled by anyone in the community who wants to take them. Or they might be modified after the pilot if we find that they're not working or the measures don't show as they should. This will allow us to help not only philanthropic investors, but the nonprofits doing the work have a clear path of scorecard measures and an ultimate horizon in the SDGs, which helps everyone understand them. I want you to look at the kind of cross connection here a little bit in Thrive. We think about housing, economics, and jobs, and you can see all of the pieces that fit together here. If you look at the bottom of either one of these slides, you'll notice that we are working constantly at the bottom level. We're doing work in these places. In fact, some people under social would think of civic or the issue of trying to deal with equity and inclusion. They might think of that as a whole thing all by itself, but it actually isn't. It's part of a much bigger circle. In social, we're measuring not only what happens at the levels down below, but we're measuring what does social capital look like? What does the measure of social capital in the region look like? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? And so then when you begin to think and leverage each of these funds against the others, you recognize that any of the investments that come into these funds, the grants that go out, will also help us start to string together some of the things at the bottom of this chart so that people don't think about them as silos. They think about them as pieces of a much bigger system. So if horizons give us a direction and literally a horizon measure, and the social determinants of health help us create a scorecard, then the next question for a nonprofit is, okay, well, how will I know that I'm actually doing the work that has efficacy in a way that I can actually see it happen? Because I can't measure myself against a global measure. And even the social determinants of health and that scorecard, there's probably nothing I as a single nonprofit could do to really move the needle in those areas. And so the next piece of this initiative is to bring a genome into play. We're working with a data scientist in Chicago who's designed a genome that brings into play data from a number of different places. For one, it brings the performance data for all the grants made in all of the specific sectors over the course of history into a single genome, tied with all of the academic theory of change data. So every time somebody wrote a dissertation or there's a study done on with a theory of change connected to it on any of the things in the genome, that ties in. All of this data is tied together so that we can then be able to measure the impact of nonprofits in this region and get a scorecard for them. And this is really for them to understand their efficacy. So efficacy is, and the one you're looking at is as an example of one, this is actually one from Chicago, I think. If your efficacy rate for what you do is 81%, that's a pretty good number. So could you get to 100% or would that cost too much? Could you do it? Could you have less efficacy and spend less money? These are tough questions and questions most nonprofits don't know how to answer because they don't have a matrix that helps them do that. So this is an example of a measure of efficacy, the program reach, how many people it reaches, how many actual outcomes they've achieved, and the cost per outcome. We can then look more closely at other levels of data to figure out how are they doing in the as part of the genome in food security for this particular organization. So you can see where they rank. Now, this is important for two reasons in philanthropy, because your work at the ground level ties to the SDGs at the top level. And if you're doing this work, you would clearly want to do it better. You'd want to get the best outcomes for the cheapest cost you could. And if your cost per outcome is really high, it could be because the quality of what you're doing is so high and it's required to be high. So these are not platform numbers. And by that, I mean, there's no perfect number. You wouldn't take this scorecard and use it to say, oh my gosh, we've got to get our cost per outcome down by $12. It is just an understanding of the level of work you're doing and how you're doing it against everyone else in the country that's doing the same thing. And the outcome of this then is that if you're going to get better as grant makers, we have the ability to make investments in organizations to help them improve their efficacy rate. Donors can choose among many organizations doing the same thing to say who's got the best efficacy rate, who's got the best cost per outcome, who's reaching the most people. To some donors, that's really important. To others, only one of those measures might be important. But I want you to note how the efficacy rate is calculated here based on the point-in-time program survey that has a control group to assess the impact on students in 2015. So this is actual data. This isn't a simple survey or something that's done in a way that we have to collect it from somewhere else and figure out what it means. This is the first time nonprofits have ever had access to this kind of data. And so this is a growing strategy over the next 5 years. And it will be complete. We expect it to be complete by 2025. But all of this information will be online as we get to the end of this year. Now, how do we get to this impact when we think about the SDGs? You really do it in 3 ways: with data, dialogue, and decisions. So the first step is to get all of the tracked data that we can get, identify the gaps in the data, and then we want dialogue. We want the people who are doing it and the people who are getting the services to be in the room to think about it, and we want to figure out who's accountable. To get to big horizons like sustainable development goals, we all have to be working in the same direction, if not at the same speed. And so right now, we have a lot of people working on problems all by themselves. some of them not collaborating with each other, and most importantly, not knowing who's accountable for it. So I found it amazing last year that the foundation funded a project in which we brought emergency managers and nonprofits and lots of people at the jurisdictions together to build an actual regional plan around what we will do if there's another mass shooting in Central Florida. In other words, what happens? Who takes what thing? Or will everyone race in chaos? It took us a year to complete it, but there's a pretty clear plan now about who's doing it. That's where dialogue pays off. Somebody takes accountability or gets accountability, and now we all know who's doing that piece of the puzzle. And then the third part of the impact are the decisions you made. So the horizons are important because that's how we know what direction we're going in and what speed we're getting there, but you have to have some lower level goals to get to the measurable success. And to my last point, this is what that looks like, moving from the individual approach through collaboration, which is a good thing, into an integrated kind of field of activity around systemic things that we're doing. So this may sound experimental to you, but it actually isn't. The foundation's been doing this work for many years around really significant problems in the community. And so it's something that is not new, but it's never been done at this level before, where we try to get the entire community together to make decisions around things instead of being as entrepreneurial as we can sometimes be. Now look, being entrepreneurial is a good thing. And I support nonprofits who are entrepreneurial. But you can't be entrepreneurial in a world with no data or where other people are already moving toward a set of goals the community has agreed on, and you're not part of that team. We have to work at this space together. And so the Thrive funds are there to build capital and to bring capital to this space. That's the most important part. And the focus is on projects that pilot, accelerate, scale, or fill gaps. So the beginning of the funding for these, which will happen after the first of the year, will be to focus on who's doing innovative things in places where we can attach measures tied to the SDGs. Well, they'll also focus on increasing income, access to housing, transportation, food, addressing economic issues through innovative approaches, prioritizing access, equity, including employment, housing, and transportation, three things that we don't have a coordinated plan on right now. So while we've got a lot of discussion going on in the region around racial justice, there aren't any clear leaders who own any piece of that. And the reason for that is the collective of us all has to come together and agree that we need change, what that change looks like. And then we have to start putting people into accountability spaces. And so at some level, the SDGs provide the right platform to do that because none of them are disagreeable. They're not political in any way. They're just the only global coordination where everyone in the world has gotten together and said, yes, we support this. And we believe these need to get done by 2030. Now, part of the problem with the recovery from the pandemic is that many of the things that we work on are more important now than they were before the pandemic. And we were working on them before. But now we have to go back to work at an accelerated pace, and people have to start thinking differently about the systemic side of what we're doing. So addressing this crisis recovery, including the immediate and short-term responses, is long-term critical to what we're doing. It's longer-term critical that we address these things now than that we try to pass through them quickly and then not think about them again. Now, at the nonprofit level, clearly capital is going to be necessary because you don't get to make big plays, change the way you're doing things, perhaps merge or acquire some other nonprofit, perhaps find ways for strategic alliance with other nonprofits. You don't go do all that stuff if there's no capital to help you do it. Thus, creating horizon goals and then just putting them out there to raise people's understanding of them doesn't do much good. So the concept for nonprofits is to adopt their own sustainable development goal or goals. And there are several nonprofits, if you look at nonprofit search, that actually touch more than one of the goals. If your nonprofit does, then that's great. Now the question is, do you have the capability and can you work in all of those sustainable development goals? Or would it make sense to focus in one of them where you might be able to get more impact and get better outcomes more quickly than you do by spreading your skills, capital, and time like peanut butter? So nonprofits have to think through, do I even know what my sustainable development goals are? Which ones I connect to? Am I working in that space now? Are the outcomes I'm generating and producing, do they align with the SDGs? Or am I trying to do something that doesn't align with what the world has agreed is the right direction to go? I'm not trying to turn all the nonprofits on this call into robots. I'm not saying you should go do these things because the world has agreed to it. But I would say to you that alignment of goals and outcomes is what aligns capital. So in the future, if you want people to make gifts to you, you're going to have to give them a theory of change and ties to accountability that they can see you're producing. Otherwise, people will always fund nonprofits by a wish list of things they want without thinking about what it takes to get to the outcomes that they're trying to satisfy. So I would suggest that you visit the website and take a look at Thrive and at Nonprofit Search if you haven't looked at either of those under the initiative sections of the website. And you can follow the scorecards on there, which will be updated continually. Right now they are in what I would call draft mode. The funds have been launched and are acquiring capital now and should begin making grants on first projects in the first quarter. And so you'll hear a lot from the foundation around what that looks like. And shortly we'll have, in fact, I believe the middle of October, we have a number of fellows who will be joining the foundation, and their role will be to work around each of these funds to engage nonprofits and community members who are doing the work in these spaces around discussions to identify what are the things that are most needed and what kinds of initiatives are underway out there being thought about, who's doing work right now in these spaces, and then to try to align the goals and the measures around the activity that will come out of that process. I also want to touch base with you for a minute around nonprofits that aren't as sophisticated, who look at this and go, oh, that's big, that's over my head. It is not difficult for you to identify the goal that you fall under, which sustainable development goal you fall under, and then just to align your outcomes as best you can with what the initiative pieces of that sustainable development goal are. And you can go online to look at all of the goals, and you can just Google sustainable development goals and you'll find 1,000 websites that'll give you the deep look, or you can go to the United Nations website where they have an entire separate website that deals with sustainable development goals. It's not the academic exercise of understanding the goals to their depth. It's understanding that this is the first time the world has ever had a common language around things that we all do that are very complex every day. And while we may be moving in a marathon fashion, a step forward at a time, what we're not doing is really focusing our issues, goals, and capital on those bigger horizons. And I think that's particularly going to be the case in things like housing, and certainly in homelessness, certainly in economic stability. It's certainly the case in racial justice. It's hard now to get a common understanding from everybody of what they think is important and what they want to do first. But we're on the road to that, and this allows us some guidance and helps us get to that space faster. So I'm going to unshare the screen so I can see you now, because I want to have some discussion around this. If you've got questions that you've put in the chat, that's terrific. And if you don't, then we can just continue this as a discussion. But my first question to you, I would be interested to know if there's anyone on the call today that is currently using sustainable development goals in your work, or has looked at them, or has identified how what you do connects with those goals. What experiences, if any, do you have with sustainable development goals? That'll help me know how to measure the rest of the discussion here. Anybody currently working in that space?
Hi, Mark. Caitlin Augustine. I work at an organization called Datakind, and we're a global nonprofit headquartered in New York, but with staff around the world. And I would say all of our work is guided by the SDGs. We've actually organized, the work that we do is, as a nonprofit, we are actually a service provider to other nonprofits to bring data science in the service of humanity to organizations who might not have strong data science capacity or data literacy. And so we've organized our work into what we've called impact practices around specific SDGs. So we have one around ending poverty, and we're working with about 15 organizations to identify problems within the sector that could be solved with data science. Similarly, we're working in maternal health, and particularly in frontline health systems. So I would say it's a great organizing principle and kind of gives clear metrics that you can speak to many actors in the space and be aligned with them.
So I think, so you are the future, just for the record. As we've worked through, on the academic side, as we've worked through SDGs for the last 5 years, it is about the market actually taking hold of this. So we work at the foundation with the Brookings Institute, with the Mott Foundation, and they have been busy trying to help educate nonprofits about the need to use your services, your kind of data services, because data is the missing component in most of this. But the problem is, until the marketplace understands what SDGs are and how they work, it's difficult for people to align behind them. So anytime we can create systems where it's not complicated, you don't have to look under the hood of this to figure it out. You can use it if you're just a donor trying to figure out, am I doing the greater good that I think I'm doing with the money that I'm investing? Is that working? If you're a nonprofit and you go, okay, I'm working in the right direction, but now I want to improve my efficacy, or I want to find a way to reduce my cost per outcome, or I want to see how I can get to a better level. All of those things would be important. And so I think for any of you that are looking to get deeper into that, people like Caitlin who are doing this kind of work are perfect folks to connect with, to think about how do you get the data you need. The last session that I was in, those of you who were in that one, clearly data is how you build theories of change. If you have no data, it's really difficult to build a theory of change. And it isn't a validated theory of change unless it's academically validated, model validated, or performance validated, which all require data. And so at some level, the jump point, the difficult point, and one of the things I want you to be thinking about as you head to the last session today, Tom Breyer's going to be asking, what could you be doing differently in your space? What could you be thinking about improving? What steps would you take this year from what you've heard or learned here today? And he's going to be asking for us to think about that. And he's going to ask what we talked about in this session that might get us to that space. Because if we don't kind of help each other in this, and if we don't work on it with a clear data set, it's going to be complicated to get there. The rest of the world is already going in this direction. So unfortunately, this is a space we have to catch up in. Europe is far more literate in the sustainable development goals. Africa is far more literate in the sustainable development goals than the US is in some places. So these kinds of moves, the work that Caitlin's doing and some of the things that are being done in communities around America, we're just at stage 1 of this. But it's time for everybody to get on board, because if you don't, when the train leaves, it'll be harder to catch it. Now, I'm just looking here to see if there are any questions I can try to answer. And I'd love to hear from anybody else who has a thought or an opinion around this, or specifically if you've got something you think you can do or you want to work on this year that might get you closer to being able to align with the SDGs, or if you already align with some of them and you're doing work in this space.
Dr. Brewer, do you want me to read all the questions, or you can read them out from the comment section?
You're welcome to read them to me. That's fine. You pick the ones you like best.
I think they're all great questions. So I will read Isabella Jones. I'll read her question.
Okay.
I'm currently interning with IDAS that focuses on local and international environmental projects such as tree planting and well building to fight climate change. Every project we work on is connected to one or more SDGs.
Yes, Ideas is a great organization. That'll be a good experience for you. And they are on the front lines of doing this kind of work. One of the problems is that you'll note that the intern work that you're doing there and the kinds of projects they have fit really well with environmental sustainability and other kinds of sustainability. They literally, I think, couldn't do their work unless they tied to SDGs. The problem in this sector is that some others don't think their work is big enough to tie it to the SDGs. And that would be wrong, because everything you build starting on that path provides an opportunity for you to adjust the horizon. You don't have to get to the SDG, you just have to be moving in the direction of the SDG to be able to talk to investors and others. And one of the things that Ideas does very well is they go to their investors and they say, here's what we're working on. Here's the world's understanding of what that looks like. So when we tell you what our theory of change is to get there, we can prove it to you because we're working against SDGs and all the stuff that we're working on. So I think that the UN has been watching them pretty closely too, and I think they're an example of what I would call a new generation organization that literally from their beginning worked in that space. So congratulations on that.
Okay, that was the only question I saw. Is there any other questions anybody wants to ask? Oh, there's one more. Okay, this is from Sean Tate. Hi, Mark. A big challenge for us is how to convince donors to allow a percentage of their funding to go to R&E or M&E, which would allow NPOs to invest finance and resource into aligning with the SDGs. We have to use our unrestricted or self-generated funds to cover these costs. Is there a standard amount to allocate to R&E?
So that's a great question, Sean. There's not a standard amount, but what you'll find in most cases is that the difference between big data and small data is really where you're at in asking this question. So you want, typically you're going to need 10% of everything you do to be part of that strategy of getting the core data or testing the data on the back end to figure out what happens next. So there's not a core piece. And I would say to you also that you want to look for foundations that would make grants to you, not for the programmatic work that you're doing, but specifically capital grants to pay for what I would call the R&D side, the research and development side, to make certain that you can tie things to the SDGs. The thing's going to get difficult, Sean, is that going forward, at some point, foundations are going to start to demand that data, but yet they're not funding it unless you ask for it. And so you need to build a theory of change for your organization that clearly shows that the data drives the work you do. And specifically in Africa right now, where for the most part, everything that gets done there is tied to an SDG in some other part of the world. So the people that are putting money into Africa from other places are using the SDGs. And so I think the problem with trying to use a revenue grant to fund the data side or to fund the alignment side gets difficult. This is really a capital question. So I wish I had a better answer for you, and I wish I was closer to you, because I might be able to give you some referrals of people that you could talk to. But the answer is that you have to think of that as a separate issue in order to get funders to kind of come alongside with you.
Thank you, Sean. He joined us from South Africa. Our next question is from Greg Smith. In the US foundation world, do you know what percentage of mid-sized to large foundations are trying funding to SDGs?
Right now, it's probably 20% of them, and there are some core foundations, the Ford Foundation, the folks at Kresge, the Mott Foundation. They're very tied to SDGs right now. So you can see this kind of as a wave that's coming. Last will likely be family foundations. There are some family foundations in Florida who are tied to SDGs now. And those that are using SDGs aren't using them for their entire measurement set. What they're trying to figure out is, are they on the path? And the way foundations typically get to this is not to start demanding that you do it, but they first start by tying all of their grant making to SDGs so they can see where are they playing. So the Central Florida Foundation actually plays in about 9 of these SDGs. There are some of them clearly our grant making doesn't go into because there are things that aren't relevant for our community. But at the end of the day, you'll see this as a wave, and I think over the next 5 years, the bigger foundations are going to push the middle-sized foundations and smaller foundations to do it. And in some cases, they're sharing money with each other in order to get it done. And so I think those foundations understand the question that Sean asked. And so as they get closer to wanting you to use SDGs, I think you'll see them put some money up to help you do it because they recognize that might be a big jump if you're starting from scratch.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Brewer. Our next question is from Caitlin Augustine. A question we're wrestling with is how to explain the organization's long a digital data systems strategy can take to be adopted and how to make that resource investment. How have you advised on this in the past? And she has a second part to her question, which is, do we significant correlation with end users to build data and solution trust, but some organizations don't have that capacity. How do we ensure the encourage adopters to ensure the safety of any data solution?
Yeah, those are great questions. So there's always a question of, are you measuring me, or are you and I together being accountable by me sharing my data with you? And so that's where the dollars comes in. That's where money happens. I think to your first question, Caitlin, getting organizations to understand data monitoring and why you're doing data monitoring is really a systems answer. So it's some of what I talked about in the theory of change piece that I did a while ago. You can't get to a theory of change. I can't really find out whether or not you're hitting your theory of change without data. So this is going to be one of those times where to sell data and the need for data to people who aren't used to using data or don't know how to use it starts with you getting to the outcome of why you're doing it and what it means and why it's possible for you to help them get to that space. And that might be the first and best way to do it. The co-creation with end users to build data solution and trust is really the answer. I mean, you have to do it together. As a foundation, when we want data from organizations, we make grants to them. So when I showed you the data in the middle there, the efficacy data, we did that for 500 nonprofits. We funded them. We said, all we want from you is data, and we're going to collect it, and we're going to analyze it, we're going to share it with you, and then together we're going to use it to see how we can help you build capability and capacity. And so the reality was that they were all fine, willing to do it. So it might be, this for you might be a partnership with a larger funder somewhere who might come along to help in that co-creation of those strategies. It might be piloting some things that would get the attention of both funders and nonprofits. Nonprofits, for the most part, depending on their sophistication, will not like to do anything that they're not capable of doing, and they typically don't like to do things that are mandated to them by funders, but there's no funding for, to some earlier questions here. So partnering with a funder or two that sees the importance of the data that you're providing might be a way that you could get some pilots done in which nonprofits would learn something, the community would learn something, you get some data, and you might get some creation capability there out of it. And it might open the door for nonprofits that hadn't thought about wanting to do this with
you. Is there any other question?
Thank you, Kakali. Thank you, Mark. That was exciting, a little scary, I think, for many small nonprofits. Collecting data is something that they do in many different ways. And so I think you opened some eyes, and now we know that certainly that Caitlin Augustine and her company are out there, Datakind, and I saw her little offer in the chat for pro bono work, so you might want to follow up with Caitlin as to how she might help you, and certainly check with the Central Florida Foundation about ways that if your nonprofit doesn't have a profile with them, if you haven't connected, I strongly encourage you to do that in Central Florida. And at this point, if there aren't any other questions, other than all the wonderful, there is, all right, some people are already connecting there with Caitlin. So what I would suggest you do is at this point, we're going to close the session, and please move to the final session. It's probably the most exciting because it's sort of like a debrief. Everyone gets to share the key ideas that were shared in all the other sessions. And Dr. Brewer is very adept at helping us all sort of move forward. How do we personally or as an organization move forward with what we've learned?